All right, everybody. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for being here today as we release the comprehensive annual financial report for the city for 2018. I think you know that the big event in 2018, of course, was leaving distress status, or at least being the first year that we are out of distress status, and it was a strong year financially for the city of Pittsburgh. We were able to generate a surplus of $3 million, which allowed us, or more than $3 million, close to $4 million, which allowed us to increase the fund balance, meaning the unrestricted fund balance, meaning like the city's savings account, able to increase that to $114 million, which is more than 20% of our budget. So it's a very strong financial position for the city. I would tell you that, we've had prior years where we've had bigger surpluses, but in this year, when you think about the added costs, the added transfers that we did this year. We moved $26 million out of fund balance to the capital budget this year. We moved $10 million, did a housing grant to the Housing Opportunity Fund over at the URA, and we actually doubled this was the year that we doubled the parking obligation to the pension fund. So an additional $13 million went into the pension fund. And while doing all that, we were still able to generate a surplus. So let's take a look at where we are, and this is, again, we've talked about this, where our money comes from in any given year. The one thing I would say about this is, I've said it before, when you look at that half of the money that we spend comes from two sources, our real estate tax and our earned income tax. The idea that there are a bunch of people from out in the suburbs or somewhere else paying the way or paying the freight of the city of Pittsburgh, the fact of the matter is that the things that we do in this city are still the burden for the most part of the people who live here, the people who own property here. When you see that our earned income tax generates 20% of our revenues and real estate 30% of our revenues, fully half of what we raise just in those two taxes alone. And remember that city residents also pay much of the remaining tax burden that you see before you. Keeping in mind, of course, that our biggest revenue source, the real estate tax, is in a situation where our city is about 40% of our properties in the city are exempt from taxation, so that adds to the burden. And the fact that the earned income, which is only paid by people who actually live in the city of Pittsburgh, and that's been a shrinking number. We're continuing to lose population. So those are probably the continue to be the financial challenges that we have on revenues. Just to talk a little bit about some specifics that I thought were interesting this year, we saw a big reduction in revenues for parking enforcement, meaning parking tickets. So there are significantly fewer revenues for parking tickets. I talked to Dave Honorato about it this morning, and a lot of that is attributable to the fact that we now have these apps that allow people to remotely up their time on meters, and so there's been a better compliance rate than we've had in the past, and that's good news. But it does affect our revenues. On the reverse side of that, we did see an increase in meters, our revenues from meters as well. So unfortunately, we share that to a greater degree with the parking authority. So we don't get it's not a one-for-one deal. So we see a little bit of a drop there. We also had an increase in our parking tax, which kind of made up for it. So all in all, it was a wash, but still a good story that we have so many more people who are actually complying with our parking meters. The other one I want to point out to is it's not a big revenue source, but I thought it was just great to see that when you look at investment returns, investment income. I'm not talking about pension here. I'm just talking about our general fund investments. We're doing a much better job of managing our money, and so Jen Gula, over in the finance department, who oversees that operation, she really does go out of her way to make sure we are constantly getting the best return on taxpayer dollars in the various banks that we deal with. As you know, we go through a local banking renewal every couple of years, and part of that is making sure that we're getting best returns, and that's beginning to pay off. We actually doubled what we collected last year in that, from just under $1 million to just over $2 million this year, just in investment earnings on money that's sitting in our various bank accounts. Let's talk about where the money goes, and this is a familiar picture, right? More than half of the money we spend goes to public safety. This points to the fact that this is really our big challenge. We are required to pay for a government that is a very big city in the daytime, right? When people come here to work, we've got to protect them and our city residents. But all of that, or a big chunk of that burden, is really borne by the people who live here, and that continues to be the biggest financial challenge that we have. How do we continue to have a city for a much bigger population than the population who's actually paying for that government? So it continues to be a problem. A little bit about overall spending. This is this is basically your operating budget, but overall spending increased pretty dramatically this year. A $39 million, when you consider operating and capital spending, a $39 million increase in spending, and that's mainly because of a couple factors. One is we bought an overpriced building over on the Boulevard of the Allies. I call it the Permits Palace. I'm still bothered by that purchase, that we spent that much money for a building to house our employees and the Housing Authority and URA. But and then we also did $10 million for the grant to the Housing Opportunity Fund, which I mentioned earlier. So pretty big increase in spending overall. But still, it allowed us to, the year as all, allowed us to increase our fund balance again. And as you can see the trend, we continue to grow that savings account. Again, this year, more than 20% of budget, which is very healthy when you look at what the GFOA standards are, which is only 10%. So we're living within we're living in a pretty good area right there when we're that high on our savings account. The earned income tax, again, this is something that's grown every year, as we've seen. Let me talk a little bit about this. The big jump that we had back in 2012 to 2013 was mostly attributable to Act 32, which allowed or really enforced stronger withholding rules on employers, so that they had to withhold taxes on all their employees and get that money to the appropriate government where it belonged. We created 5 bureaus around Allegheny County that basically centralized that collection. And so you can see that you saw a big jump there. But even since then, we've seen increases every year. A lot of it in the past, I think, attributable to increased wages because we weren't really seeing job growth. Although this year, that seems that it may have changed. This year, when you look at the local services tax, for the first time since I've been here, we've seen a significant bump in the $52 tax, the local services tax. That is a tax on jobs, right? That's a tax on it's like the old occupational privilege tax. It's a tax on jobs. So we've seen an increase in the number of people who are working in the city of Pittsburgh. It doesn't necessarily mean that they are city residents. This is charged to every job in the city. So it's so for the first time, I don't know how many times I've talked about how stagnant we are in this tax, and for the first time this year we see a bump, and so I think that portends good things for us moving forward with respect to job growth in the city of Pittsburgh for the first time in a long time. And I think it's consistent with what we saw earlier in the week. There was a study, the labor and industry or labor statistics came out earlier in the week that showed our regional labor force numbers and our unemployment numbers, unemployment down now below 4, and the labor force back up again. So consistent with those numbers, we're seeing job growth here in the city of Pittsburgh. These are the other tax categories, just to give you a taste of some of the taxes that were up this year. Payroll prep, again, both for that's a tax on your payroll, on a company's payroll, private company's payroll. So you would see that both wages and job numbers being up would contribute to that number being on the increase. Real estate, up $4.6 million. You know, we are seeing properties that are now maturing through the abatement process, coming back onto full taxability, as well as some activity down in with respect to occupancy and building permits that are being communicated to the Assessment Bureau, and assessments going up. So we see an increase in real estate revenue as a result of that. I previously mentioned parking up again, which is helpful. And then amusement, slight increase in amusement tax. You know, when you're bringing $17 million from the events that we have around the city, you realize how important some of those big summer events, as troublesome as they can be sometimes, are really help the bottom line of the city. Again, this is other great news. Long-term debt, right? We even in a year where we borrowed $40 million for the Permits Palace, we were able to lower our debt. We borrowed $40 million in 2018, but we paid off $56 million. And so we see a big drop, well, not a big drop, but a continued drop in our long-term debt to right around $400 million a year, which is a really good number. Now, we borrowed this year and are now on a more regular schedule of capital borrowing, which just again points to the financial health of the city, and another reason why we were able to leave distressed status. So that's all good news. Now let's talk about some of the bad, the one piece of bad news, right? The invested portfolio of the pension fund. Okay, so last year, toward the end of the year, we had a pretty significant market drop that caused the pension fund to lose about $20 million overall. It's, this is what happens. We have periods where we're going to have a market fluctuation. So we ended the year on a bad note, but there's good news in this picture as well. And first off, let me say that while we lost $20 million, we had a 4.5% loss. That actually beat the market, right? So the S&P last year was down 6.5% for the year. The Dow was down about 6% for the year. So, having the diversified portfolio that we have, we protect a little bit on the downside, so we didn't have as big a loss as the market had. And maybe even the better news is that we've already recovered that, right? The market has run up since the end of the year. S&P hit a new high today, and we are already back. In fact, when we get the first quarter numbers at our meeting tomorrow, you'll see that not only have we recovered that money, but we actually are beyond that high point, and year end in 2017 will be beyond that number. That was at around $450 million. We're now at around $463 million or so in the invested portfolio of the pension fund. So we've recovered that money, which is great news. But I think the better news long term is that we are now seeing, to some degree, a light at the end of the tunnel on the pension fund, or at least a plan to get there. If you want to, when you get a chance, look at pages 137 and 138 of the CAFR, where you'll see the actual numbers that, we did have a loss. We went from $446 million down to $426 million in the fund last year. But when you see how the city is contributing, the city is actually contributing enough money between the city, the employees, and the state contribution. We're contributing as much as we're paying out to our beneficiaries. So we're not dipping into the fund anymore to pay annual contributions. We did it in 2018. It's the first year we did it. And we're going to continue to do it, at least by the plan. The 5-year plan calls for us to do that every year. If we can do that, continue to do that, and just allow this portfolio to grow, let's say we do that. We continue to pay the benefit payout and allow this to sit. Even if we only earn 5% over the next 20 years, we're going to have $1 billion in 17 years. That's the power of compound interest, right? Or at least our investment interest, whatever you want to call it, or compound investment proceeds. At 5%, now we know that we're probably going to do better than that, but let's say we don't. Let's say over that 20-year period we have 5%. In year 17, we're going to have $1 billion in that fund. If we do better, if we get 6%, we're going to be there in 14 years. And at 7%, we'll be there in 12. And so we, for the first time since I've been here, we actually are implementing a plan to fully fund our pension obligation. And we're getting there, slow but sure. We have a long way to go. But when we look back and people talk about, I remember people calling it a scheme, the big scheme when we decided to take pension dollars and put them into the pension fund. But for the first time, we have a dedicated source of revenue going into the pension fund every year. Now it's double what it was last year, and that's going to continue on for the next 25 years, Bill, or so, unless we could extend it if we want to. But for now, 25 years. When we get out in those out years, we're going to be 80% funded or better. And so we're finally there, where we finally have a plan to get there. So while this is a negative look that we had a slight drop at year end in 18, the overall trend is a very positive one, and a good message for our future. And with that, I'll stop. again, it's a strong year. You know, 3 million surplus doesn't, for 4 million surplus doesn't sound like a lot, but when you realize how much money we've actually put into things. One thing I would tell you about that, we moved $26 million from our savings account, 26 million from our 114, well, 110 last year to pay-go funding for capital projects. We only spent 10 of it. There's another 16 million sitting in the project fund that we could have left in this fund and shown a surplus of, you know, 15 million, so or more, or close to 20 million. But so that it's a good story. It's sometimes we move money over to the, you know, I do get a little concerned when we're moving pay-go money over to the capital fund and when we don't have the capacity to actually spend it. It's still money that we have, and it still puts us in a very strong position. So I'll close there and take questions.